Hey, everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us a living, breathing human rights hero, you could say. Some people have referred to him over time as the dictator hunter and by a whole series of other names. But tonight, we have with us, very fortunately, Mr. Reed Brody speaking to us from France. Welcome to Democracy Tomorrow, Reed.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Happy to be here.
So, what do you think? Both you and I have been involved in the human rights field for many decades now, hopefully many decades more. Certainly for me, and I presume for you, like in the early years of our human rights careers, it was as if the sky was the limit with each passing year. At least for me, it was just like doors were flinging open that had been shut solidly, during the entire Cold War in particular. And then after 89, everything became possible, which was impossible before. I think even at a degree that we didn't even realize the scale of what the change was. I know I didn't. I just rode the wave, but I didn't really appreciate it adequately, how much things had gone in a justice direction. And now we have, the countervailing forces are up to all sorts of nefarious deeds all across the world. So now, there was a time when we were living in a world where there were fewer dictators than before, where the human rights protections that were afforded people seemed to be growing by the year, where human rights advocates across the world were winning and winning and winning. The International Criminal Court was set up. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was set up. Countless new initiatives were undertaken at the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The list goes on and on and on. And now we find ourselves in this era of re-emerging popularity of populist authoritarian leaders. So, given that you've worked for so many years trying to apply principles of justice to dictatorial regimes, in particular in Chad and a range of other countries, what are some of the lessons that you have learned about how to better resist dictatorship and how to reduce the likelihood in the future of more and more dictators coming into power?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important question. First, let me backtrack. I mean, I get called the dictator hunter, and my book is called To Catch a Dictator, and it's a very catchy title. Things, it, you know, it doesn't exactly describe what I do, and I think it it um, it doesn't really reflect the serious work that I try to do together with civil society and victims to bring justice, to those who are fighting for justice. Um, that said, this is the it is the field um, that I've been working in for the last 30 years, and um, I do think that there is clearly a rise of authoritarianism today. I mean, we're not living, 1998 um, was, the high point for international justice. Um, it was the creation in Rome of the International Criminal Court. A few months later, it was the arrest of Pinochet in London. There was a different world really seemed possible. I mean, there are many times in my life that a different world seemed possible. I mean, I remember 1979, if I can, go back, 1969, if I can go back all the way to 1 million people on, on the mall in Washington, standing up against the Vietnam War and thinking, when this generation matures, the world is going to be a very different place. Um, Bill Clinton was one of the people who helped organize that demonstration. He became president, and the world didn't become a different place. Um, and I think, you know, one of our failures as a movement, as a people's move, as a anti-war movement, as a human rights movement, as a progressive movement, um, is that many of the elites who took power in our era really lost touch, I think, with the struggles of people. Um, I think um, you know, in many ways, Donald Trump today um, is a result of the failures of, people like Bill Clinton, but also people like Barack Obama. Um, the growing inequality that we see in the world, in the United States in particular. I mean, you know, uh, since the financial crisis, um, but even going back further, since the financial crisis, most of the wealth in America has gone to the top 1%. The inequality has increased dramatically in the United States. And the Democrats um, are in large part to blame for that, for not tending. I mean, Democrats in America used to be the party of the little guy, the party that represented the workers, the minorities, and now it's just it's pretty much the same as the Republican Party in terms of who funds them, in terms of the interests that they respond to, and you get a. I mean, I was in Pennsylvania the week before the elections campaigning for Kamala Harris. I was knocking on doors. And I could just tell that there was no enthusiasm, that people felt that their lives were getting worse, um, and that the Democrats were not the answer, and that there was, even among people who were voting for Kamala Harris, they didn't feel like, wow, this is the answer. This is going to really change. This will make my life better. Whereas, you had that feeling with Trump, or many people had that feeling with Trump. Certainly not me, but I think and I see that. I mean, I live most of the time in Europe, and I'm speaking to you from France, where I think the same thing is happening in France. I mean, I live in an area in France where you had the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jackets protest. These are people who feel that the liberal elites have just let them go, and that the bread and butter issues are being best addressed today by the right, by the Trumps, by the Le Pens, and I think we in the human rights movement also have. I mean, I don't think human rights were necessarily the emancipatory ideology that was going to change the world. I mean, I think at best it creates the space for people to live lives of dignity and to thrive and prosper. But the focus, I think there needs to be among progressives a much greater focus on equality and on bread and butter issues. And I think we see in the United States that the people who are getting a lot of traction are people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like Bernie Sanders, like Zohran Mamdani, who just won the primary in New York City. But the Democratic Party is, and I'm sorry to go off on all in the United States, but it's certainly what I'm thinking about a lot these days, and I'm going to the U.S. To spend most of the rest of the year in New York. But I think what you're seeing is that the Democrats, even as Trump, I think is fairly unpopular in the United States, the Democrats don't seem to be the answer, and one of the reasons, there's a fight within the Democratic Party, obviously the Democratic establishment is totally scared of Zohran Mamdani and what he represents, because they are getting, I mean, most of the establishment Democrats get the same funding um, that the Republicans. I mean, they're feeding at the same trough, um, and I think, okay, one cannot underestimate the importance of money in American politics. And so you have the establishment Democrats on the, I mean, they on the one hand, there's the base, not the entire base, but a strong part of the base. Um, and I mean, in many ways, I feel in America like there's such an exciting new world, as Graham should say, that's struggling to be born, and the old world is refusing to die. And I see that within the Democratic Party, within the within the left of center space in America, that you have this real fight between people who want to create this new world, and people who are tied by funding. Barack Obama, in particular, put his finger on the scale, put his thumb on the scale twice to prevent Bernie Sanders from becoming the Democratic candidate. He did it with Hillary Clinton, and he did it with Joe Biden. And I think that's, and he was not the transformative president. I mean, Donald Trump got 49.8% of the vote, and he is changing everything. I mean, Thomas Jefferson once said that you don't make great changes, you don't do important changes with a small minority, with a small majority. And that's what Trump is doing, though. I mean, he's taking his 49.8%, and he's changing everything. Barack Obama had 53%. He had both houses of Congress. He probably would have had more than 53% if he hadn't been black. He had a huge mandate, and he basically, created some healthcare reform, important healthcare reform that is now being undone. But he didn't transform the country. I remember when Colin Powell endorsed Barack Obama. Colin Powell, who has stains on his history, but when he said, "I'm endorsed because I think he can be a transformative president," and he was not. And basically, it was just more of the same. He responded to the financial crisis by bringing on the old Clinton people, and the old Wall Street people. And I think, since 1992, when Bill Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, that created, which perhaps was important in many, I think the transformation of America from manufacturing to other sectors is irreversible and positive. But that was a moment that basically the Democratic Party let go of the working class in America. Sorry, but I see this all over the world. And I don't think that we're going to fight dictatorship and authoritarianism just by raising the flag of democracy and human rights. I think we have to talk about what is of concern. We have to build a larger coalition than that. We have to talk about what affects, the little guy.
Right. Well, if we stick to the human rights dimensions of the little guy, what we're really talking about is economic, social, and cultural rights, right? Of course, combined with civil and political. But basically, the stuff that I've worked on, in particular, you've worked on, the right to adequate housing, the right to health, the right to education, the right to culture, the right to work, the right to form trade unions, the right to a decent living wage, blah, 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 blah. Those have been around since the beginning of the human rights, era, 1948 and onwards. But they haven't been taken nearly as seriously as civil and political rights. And these are clearly the consequences of that are playing themselves out today, not just in the United States, but as you said, in Europe and elsewhere. And, I believe that of all the countries I've had to, basically struggle against at the UN during my activist at the UN days, the one I had to fight against the most was the United States, because they were always actively opposing any new initiatives on economic, social, and cultural rights. So protecting the rights of the poor, basically, increasing minimum wage, which remains at staggeringly low levels in the United States, making housing into a human right instead of a commodity that's bought and sold and increasingly out of reach for people. The list goes on. So these are classic social democratic issues that should be part and parcel of Democratic Party politics. And so they have not embraced them nearly adequately enough. And when there's an absence of embrace by the party that you think is meant to represent you as a poor person or as a lower middle class person, whatever you want to call it, and they're not doing it, well, guess what? When there's only two options, remember, there's a lot of countries that have 20 political parties, and you can turn to any of them. We had 34 parties or something, participating in the most recent election here a couple months ago. But when you have only two and one of them's not doing it, then you go to the other guy, and they have clever analysts who say, let's go for the poor guys because they're going to vote for us because the Democrats aren't doing that. Let's pretend that we're on their side, even though, of course, they're not. I mean, all of the decisions that taken under the context of the Project 2025 stuff, none of them are pro-poor at all. And so, as you said, both parties are beholden to the corporate sector. Both of them are completely. I mean, we used to say, replicrats and demoblicans, right? I mean, there really is no structural deep difference between the two, and certainly the absence of any third, fourth, or fifth, or sixth party, just not there, right? So I think money needs to be removed from politics entirely. And that's what I've always proposed. And just make elections publicly financed. We have really strict rules in Australia. They've even been made more strict in recent months about there's an absolute cap on the amount of money a political party can spend on a federal election here. And it's a very low amount. It's less than 100 million total for the whole country. So by comparison, it's very little. So, there's all these, I think there are solutions to all these problems, basically. None of them are out of control to the degree that AI is out of control, for instance. There are practical things that can be done to make societies more democratic and more attuned to the needs and wishes of their population. But it really, back to the dictator theme, it really does have a feeling now that fewer and fewer people are reading their history books. Fewer and fewer people understand the almost inevitable logical conclusion to any dictatorial regime throughout history has been demise, right? And very often brutal demise. I mean, the list, it would take me hours to read the list of dictators who were deposed in very gruesome circumstances, who then led to the emergence of a new form of democracy. They never end well. I mean, it didn't end well for Gaddafi. It didn't end well for Ceausescu. It didn't end well for Somoza. It didn't end well for Hitler. It didn't end well for Mussolini. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. We all know that if you look at history. So that's why it's a bit, confusing that so many people are still looking towards this strong man ideal, as somehow a vehicle which is going to take people out of their misery. So I think, I agree with all your analysis there in the US, but I also think globally, clearly the remedy is there. And it's like, look at the inequality in your society and why is it like that? Europe is much more equal, right, than the United States.
Yes, Europe is much more equal, and Europe is a little more historical than America. I mean, people are getting dumber. People are getting less. I think the means of control, I mean, are much greater today. I do believe, as Martin Luther King said, that, the arc of humanity, the moral arc of humanity is long, but it bends towards justice. Um, and, in many ways, uh, the world is a better place. It's a better place for women, in most countries. It's a better place, in terms of diversity and equality. Um, uh, But the issues we're talking about, it's hard for people who are not well educated, which is more and more the case in the United States, um, to look at these historical trends. People are fed. I mean, in in the United States, but also around the world. People are getting their news in 5-second bites. We are the victims of algorithms that spin off and that divert people from these issues, from pocketbook issues, from seeing in many ways what is, how what their condition is and how it can be improved. Trade unions are less important. Places where people congregate outside of people are atomized today. They spend more time on their screens. Um, and when you look at the people who are lined up behind Donald Trump at his inauguration, you know, you see Twitter and you see Amazon and you see you know, Facebook, and these are the people who control what a lot of Americans, but not just Americans, but what a lot of people around the world is getting as their information diet. I mean, in you know Europe, probably more than other places, people have a historical sense. They're grounded in centuries of history. I mean, I was on my way up here. I was listening to a podcast from, France Inter, a 12-part podcast on the Dreyfus affair. You know, um, people are much. I mean, you have that in. I mean, France is a good example. I mean, the most listened to um, radio station in France is a public radio station, are the public radio stations, France Inter, France Culture, France Info, which are very sophisticated and very deep in history and culture. The United States, they just wiped out the public. I mean, basically wiped out public broadcasting. Um, so, and this is the struggle. I mean, the struggle of as Milan Kundera said, is the struggle of man against memory against forgetting. Is the struggle of man against power. Is the struggle of memory against forgetting.
Well, I mean, this current age, it can be very depressing for people and give them a sense of hopelessness and things like that. But at the same time, there's a logical nature to it, right? There's always a pendulum swing in politics, right? And these nationalistic sentiments and these white supremacist or whatever racist kind of sentiments exist now out in the open, they're always there, right? And now there's sort of a license given to, let it be shown in public. And same thing with supporting extreme right wing things and hating immigrants all of a sudden after welcoming them in for decades and helping them to, using them to create greater prosperity. Suddenly they're bad and evil and horrible, and we don't like their religion, etc. So, in a way, there's a logical nature to it, which is this backlash that has come on the heels of the progressive wave that flowed through since the end of the Cold War, right? And so, the hope is that when people see how bad this authoritarian phase is and what it yields, because I mean, the recent budget in the United States, this absurdly called big beautiful bill, that just devastates ordinary people in so many ways. I mean, 17 million people will be removed from Medicare, Medicaid benefits in that country. I mean, that's just a staggering thing. That's just one of thousands of things. So sooner or later, people will realize that this authoritarian phase is not as promising as it was sold to them to be. But I think where we're lacking is what comes next then? What is we're not going to go back to some, communist party Soviet model. That didn't really work. We're not going to go back to some, Nazi sort of hardcore, eradication of entire people's approach on the other extreme. Basic capitalism is probably entrenched for at least a time being more. It depends on what form it takes. But what will politics become? And even green politics, which was so promising for so long, is starting to show its structural weaknesses in many, many countries, including here, where they hold the balance of power and stuff. They've done many, many great things, but they make some serious errors from time to time. So what comes next? And our wish, of course, is that we take the biggest leap that we've ever taken as a species politically, which is from moving from the nation state model that we've lived with for 400 years now to the next stage of the unstoppable arc that you mentioned, the evolutionary arc towards justice, which brings into existence a system of governance and politics that is premised not on our differences, but on our similarities for once. And we start with the simple fact that we all happen to live on the same planet and we all have the same needs and so on and so forth. All these basic things that we somehow forget about in the interests of trying to find difference between us, in an age when we have every single bit of human knowledge ever produced available right this second at the touch of a finger. It's there for us, for the taking. We've never had that before. And so the ability to communicate with people across borders has never been greater. The ability to travel across borders has never been greater. The ability to actually move and migrate, even though you may hear contrary things in the news, the possibility of moving country to country has never been greater, if you have the resources to do it and the wherewithal to do it. And so on and so forth. And the global economy is still deeply integrated and becomes more so in other ways, even though there are tariffs being applied. So there's a lot of, things that are pushing us in that direction, but somehow we can't get there, and these are not new ideas by any stretch. They've been around for thousands of years. So can we use this bad time as a springboard to something far better? That's my question.
I think there's a lot to look. I mean, Bangladesh, eighth largest country in the world, last year had a popular uprising and overthrew an increasingly authoritarian regime. I mean, this was a student protest that became a revolution. We can learn a lot from that. In the United States, Bernie Sanders and AOC are drawing huge crowds. Huge crowds, bigger crowds than the president. In New York City, I mean, my son and his friend, they're all like totally psyched with Zoran Mandani. It is possible. But the conditions are harder today. But you see, I mean, the country I work in a lot in Senegal, basically last year, the president tried to change the constitution, run for a third term. People said no. I do a lot of Senegalese media, so I'm saying that I wish in my country people had the same, attachment and visceral attachment to democracy that they do in Senegal. I think there are a lot of examples around the world of movements. I mean, we're seeing now in Hungary, which is my other nationality. We're seeing finally people standing up to Orban. As you say, I mean, the everything is out there. We know. I mean, look what's happening. I mean, Gaza is actually. I was going to say. I mean, Gaza is actually an animating force in among young people around the world. and in the United States. I mean, it's another reason why the Democrats lost. Um, I mean, this is available, and people are seeing, what is happening. But the hill is harder because you go on. I mean, not me, because my algorithm skews towards cat videos and things and things. But for many people, the algorithm spins towards very sensational things, or right-wing conspiracy theories and things like that. But the effort is, as you're always saying, Scott, to realize that we are the same as. I mean, God, what's going on in terms of immigrants in the United States is just, God, just, I mean, I just before coming on, I was watching like this arrest of these immigrants, who were just getting tasered and beaten. Um, and yeah, I was just watching that. And I don't think a lot, I mean, there are unfortunately a lot of Americans who have been taught that immigrants are the problem in the country and they're taking away your jobs, and um, they're not deserving. Uh, but I think we're going to see, as you say, we're going to see very shortly in the United States the results of all of this. We're going to see, I mean, the state is being hollowed out. It's like one of those Jenga games where you're pulling one thing out and one thing out and one thing out, and then all of a sudden it's going to, I mean, we're going to see epidemics because there are no vaccines. We're going to see plane crashes because they don't have air traffic controllers. We're going to see Social Security checks not going out because the people aren't there. The question is what the response will be. So far, it's easy to still blame, not easy, but it's blame. Oh, this is all Biden. This is all before. This has all happened before. And I worry. I mean, we saw in Los Angeles that the reaction will be to send in the troops. We've got $75 billion more dollars for immigration enforcement and things. Um, and I think we have to just go and do what we're doing, and educate people, and talk to people, and organize, um, and offer alternatives, and fight. Um, and as a I mean, one of my jobs, I feel like, as a talking head on Spanish and on French media, is to tell people that they need to resist the United States, which is unfortunate. It's very interesting because in Europe, in all countries um, of Western Europe, um, there is a rejection of Donald Trump, a very strong rejection, huge percentages of people. And yet the governments, I mean, as we speak, Trump is in Scotland. Keir Starmer is going up to kiss his ring. Van der Leyen is going over to make a trade deal. They're not. They're doing the opposite, and that is unfortunate. But I think Australia is an interesting example because um, Albanese won in part as a reaction to Donald Trump. We saw the same thing in Canada. Um, and I think people around most places around the world see Donald Trump for who he is and want their leaders to stand up to Donald Trump. Unfortunately, so far, most people are not. Most leaders are not doing that. I mean, Spain is where I live most of the time, is actually a good counterexample because the president has been standing up to Donald Trump.
Well, there's a big price to be paid by the United States for what they're doing now, clearly. And look, I mean, when you fly to New York, and whenever that is, next week or the week after, it will be interesting to see how empty that plane is, because I mean, there have been like all these reports about just massive, massive percentages.
Why would anybody go to the United? I mean, I'm telling people come to the United States, join the resistance, but why would anybody go to the United States? Why would anybody take the chance of going to the United States right now?
Absolutely, to be, incarcerated for whatever 9 days, and people are left there without their medicine. People are dying in ICE custody at borders. I mean, just tourists that are coming in who might have, said something critical on their social media feeds or whatever. But so, but those things add up over time. I mean, the amount of Canadians that have canceled trips that were, to the United States is, measured in the millions. The planes are landing almost empty from all sorts of parts of the world, in particular, Europe. Investment is drying up. People don't want to put their money in that place. They have no idea what's going to happen. The dollar is declining. I mean, there are all sorts of factors at play.
I think the U.S. is on its is I think we're going to see um, the economy over time. I mean, certainly the soft power of America has gone down. People pity. I mean, people really pity. I was here a little village. It must be embarrassing to be an American. But lifespan is going to go. I think we're going to see all kinds of indicators go down in the United States.
Well, they're already like, and that's the remarkable thing to those of us. I mean, you were born in America, weren't you? Yeah, you were. Like, yeah, classic Brooklyn.
It says on my Wikipedia that I was born in Budapest, but it's not true.
All right. So, I was born on the left coast, you were born on the right coast. But the reputational hit that the United States has taken, of course, during the first Trump term, but particularly during these last 6 months, has been staggeringly deep, and something that, countries don't recover from very quickly. No matter who becomes president next, it's going to take a long time to repair that. And most Americans couldn't care less, right? I mean, they still don't use the metric system and all the rest. They don't want to. They think they're exceptional and so on and so forth. So who cares what Germany thinks? Who cares what Euro trash thinks? I've heard Europeans referred to as Euro trash on, like, Squawk Box, the investment TV show on television. I mean, it's just staggering. So hope, but now I think the wave of reputational damage is really growing, and you might not think that's an important thing, but it really is. And if you look at it from the macro level, clearly the American empire, which most people don't even see it as within the United States, we're just a strong, powerful country. No, you're an empire who designed the entire international legal order exactly in the way that you wanted it to be designed in 1945 when you drafted the UN Charter and forced everyone else to sign on. And you have benefited from it massively. And by having the dollar as the reserve currency and all the other things, you have massively benefited from this. And whether you like it or not, the US empire is waning. It's on the decline. And again, why don't you read history and see what happens when empires go away? It never ends smoothly and calmly and prettily. It's always, we got to hold on to it. We got to hold on to the power. We got to have the dominance. We got to keep going. We got to be the most powerful ones. We can't let China take over now, or the European Union, or anyone else. So I don't know. If I was to advise them, I would say just, do it with some grace, do it with some agility, and do it with some dignity, and show, and, also deal with the internal contradiction of wanting to be America first and still having 800 military bases around the world. So how do you fix those against one another in a consistent manner? Not very easy. And there's so many examples of that, where you have these competing interests within the Trump regime, where they want to be totally America first, but at the same time they want to control the world as well, and so on and so forth. So anyway, let's just quickly go back to a couple of the real interesting things that you have done in your life. I mean, you were deeply involved in the Pinochet trials in London, when he was the first former dictator to ever have been tried, right, by a court.
Well, he ended up not being tried, but yeah, I mean, 1998, we had just come back from Rome, where the International Criminal Court statute was approved, and 2 months later, the former president of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, is arrested in London on a warrant from a Spanish judge for crimes allegedly committed 20 years earlier in Chile. That's a separate development. Actually, has nothing to do with the International Criminal Court. Those are national courts. Um, acting under universal jurisdiction, which is the principle that some crimes are so heinous that any country in the world has the right to try those crimes. And
I just
Pinochet,
ask you, is that on the, would you say that, remember the big push for the responsibility to protect, R2P? So basically, the responsibility of the international community to intervene in domestic circumstances when the national government was failing to protect the rights of their population, right? That seems to me to be heavily on the wane. Would you say the same is true for the universal jurisdiction concept?
yes and no. Hissin Habre, this guy here, was prosecuted under universal jurisdiction. So he became the only head of state ever to actually be prosecuted. The former dictator of Chad, who was arrested in Senegal, and it actually came out of the Pinochet case because when the House of Lords so Pinochet challenged his arrest, said, "You can't arrest me. I'm a former head of state. I have immunity." That goes to the British courts, goes up to the House of Lords, which was in the Supreme Court. The House of Lords says no, you can be prosecuted anywhere in the world despite your status as a former head of state. We realized that we could use universal jurisdiction to bring to justice people who seemed out of the reach of justice, and that was real effervescence in the world of human rights and victims, and we was like, who's next? And we were approached by Chadian victims who said, well, our former dictator is now living in Senegal. Can you help the victims bring him to justice? And so he did become the only head of state actually ever to be and he was prosecuted and convicted in Senegal. Um,
And that
30
was a
years.
multi-year judicial.
It took us 16 years to get to the trial. Um, uh, what's interesting about universal jurisdiction is that it has actually been, there are a lot of trials now going on under universal jurisdiction, but they tend to be what one professor called low cost defendants. So you find a you know a Hutu, Rwandan Hutus, Bosnian Serbs, Nazis, um, uh, people who the international community wants to prosecute in general. And so they show up, or a lot of Syria, actually it's happened now, a lot of Syrian um, former officials of the Assad regime who've been arrested and tried in France and in Germany. So you see there are a lot of cases and a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, have set up international crimes units specifically to prosecute these crimes. The former, another country I'm very involved in, the Gambia, the former interior minister was arrested in Switzerland, prosecuted, and convicted of crimes. What we haven't seen is the attempts to get really high value defendants, whether they be, the former interior minister of Uzbekistan who was let off in Germany, people of the Bush administration who, were involved in torture and disappearances in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and the secret prison. Those we've always seen, the political, uh, um, basically the political cost was too high, even for European countries, to use universal jurisdiction. Um, but so I wouldn't say that universal jurisdiction is going strong, but very few uncomfortable cases have been brought. Um, look, most of the time, and this is, my main critique of international justice generally, is that prior to the warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu, basically since Nuremberg, all of the instruments of international justice have largely been directed either towards vanquished enemies like the Germans in Nuremberg, whereas no, the American carpet bombing of Dresden was not prosecuted. Um, Tokyo tribunals at the far for the tribunal for the Far East after the war, which rightly prosecuted the Japanese for atrocities in China and and around the far, but never looked at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then all of the cases in between where most of the people prosecuted were uh, Africans. Then you had Milosevic, Vladimir Putin, and it really wasn't until the warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu that international justice mechanisms you know fully targeted a strong U.S. ally, and we're seeing the result, which is that since the Netanyahu warrant, there has been sanctions from the U.S. administration. A number of European countries, which made it clear that if Vladimir Putin came to their countries, he would be arrested, have said, well, Netanyahu, 5 or 6 European countries have been very ambiguous, or at the best. I mean, some have clearly said that he would not be arrested. And Hungary dropped out of the ICC. Italy, Germany, Poland, France, Netherlands, all refused to commit to arresting. So, these double standards have been involved in the ICC, but also in universal jurisdiction. I mean, the laws in Spain, the law, well, first in Belgium, the universal jurisdiction law was allowed the prosecution of Rwandans. It was very vital in helping force eventually Senegal to prosecute, because Belgium was ready to prosecute Hissène Habré. But when a case was filed first against Ariel Sharon of Israel, and then against American officials for the first Gulf War, I was in Belgium when Donald Rumsfeld came to Belgium and said, if NATO leaders cannot come to Belgium without worrying that they might be subject to an arrest warrant, then maybe we'll have to move NATO out of Belgium. And the Belgian law, collapsed. And the same thing happened in Spain. The Spanish universal jurisdiction law was used to prosecute people from the dirty war in Argentina. It was used to prosecute a Salvadoran general for killing of the Jesuits. It was used in the Pinochet case and others. But when cases were filed against China for Tibet, against the U.S. for crimes in the Middle East, and against Israel, the law collapsed as well. So we're seeing these double standards, which really have undermined the international justice regime.
So how do we overcome those double standards as time goes on? Because obviously it's giving, you know, free reign to people to do whatever they want, even if they're under indictment at the ICC.
Well, I think, what I would like to see, and we are seeing that to some degree, countries who have taken the Netanyahu warrant and say, wow, this shows that justice can be, applied even-handedly. And a lot of the African countries were very frustrated with the ICC because it seemed to be only focusing on Africans. And now they have turned around and said, this warrant against Netanyahu shows the possibility of international justice. And I think there's that so-called Hague group that just met in Colombia, where mostly states are saying, are stepping up. I mean, the case at the International Court of Justice charging Israel with genocide was brought by South Africa. Chile just announced it was joining. Spain I mean, a lot of countries um, are joining those cases, and I think um, the South, but the South also South also has to be even-handed about it. And we can't ignore what Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine, the aggression and the crimes. So, I mean, double standards apply. I mean, unfortunately, is not a monopoly of the United States. Um, uh, but so I think we have to see, a fight to say, look, the same. I mean, the other day earlier I said, Western countries have said, well, if Netanyahu comes, we're not sure what we're going to do. South Africa and Brazil both hosted meetings of the BRICS countries that Vladimir Putin did not go to because of the indictment. South Africa and Brazil. Now, one doesn't, I mean, so I think we all have to, I mean, hopefully the peoples of the world and not just, the Western elites will take international justice as a real weapon to deal with impunity and crimes.
I mean, you could make, if you were to stand back and look at the last 80 years of international legal history, clearly the United States and Europe were the driving forces behind its creation and formulation of all the treaties and the content of the law and so on and so forth. And you really have almost a shift now happening whereby once it is used in a way that can be, a tool for justice against the very nations that created the system in the first place, and it's other guys now trying to apply it, namely countries that were under, colonial rule, etc., and others. Um, it's a time to, really stand back and reconsider the nature of the entire system in many ways, and it's got these incredible elements to it, but the double standards can't continue endlessly as time goes on, right? I mean, there has to be a point where you make the decision whether we're going to have this particular system or not. And I think, showing really positive examples how it has worked, as in the case of Habre, for instance, that you were involved with in Chad, and so many others, gives hope that there is possibility. But it's a slow slog, right? It's a Prometheus, whatever, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But that arc of history, I think, is really a very good concept to hold on to and to grasp onto. And another way of saying that is it's just evolution doing its thing. It's evolution, the unstoppable force that allowed us as humans to come into existence at all, the evolutionary force that guides the entire universe basically. Will continue on, whether there are Trumps or Putins or Pinochets or Habres, and other. And I think, the vast majority of the human race clearly has very decent values and are very kind people and very generous people and very friendly and funny people. It, I know it. We've traveled everywhere on this planet, Um, it's that similarity that also, continues to give me hope despite what you see in the news. And I think it's also important to, always point out, one of my first, well, actually the first international law professor I ever had was this guy called Tom Hovitt at the University of Oregon in 1982 or something. And so, and it was the typical class of Americans who were totally skeptical about international law, right? They said, there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no UN army, so why would anybody follow it? And blah, 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 blah. And he famously said to me, and I've quoted it a million times, international law is complied with 99.9% of the time because it's in the interest of the state to do so, right? That 0.1% when it's not complied with, that's what you read about in the headlines of the paper the next day.
Well, you can say that my professor, Lou Henkin at Columbia Law School, had a very famous saying, which is that almost all countries re- abide by almost all of the principles of international law and respect almost all of their obligations almost all of the time. You're right.
Right.
You're right.
Yeah.
It's that but that 1% is Putin invading Ukraine and committing crimes, the U.S. invading Iraq. I mean, the U.S. just bombing Iran for like as a total violation of international law. Not to mention the fact that your former Prime Minister Mark Rutte just like basically sucked up,
He even called him daddy. He even called him
called him
daddy.
daddy, said,
Oh
you
my
know.
God. That was
So
something.
yeah, it's that 1%, but that 1% is pretty devastating.
It's horrendous and heinous, but let's not, when the headlines read, you know, middle-aged man greeted another middle-aged man in the street with a smile on his face, and that's the headline, that's when you have to start worrying, right? Because that's the exceptional event, right? So most places, most people, most of the time, things are just mighty fine. But we have to also use use the violations of international law again, as a springboard to fix the system and keep pointing out better ways to move forward, you know? And, you mentioned Holland there with Mark Rutte, the longest serving prime minister ever. Just in terms of political changes, Holland was always at the forefront of the, international progressive
Yeah.
movement.
So what's going on in Holland? I mean, tell me
Well,
what's going on in Holland.
that was one of the main reasons I moved there and became a citizen all those years ago. But in the last election, right, you had this massive right wing backlash with the PVV party, the Geert Wilders party, the right wing kick all the foreigners out and ban Islam, basically shut down the mosques and everything. Overwhelming majority. When you look at the color coded map of the country after that election, the entire thing was blue, except for the inner city areas of Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam, and a couple other cities where it was like Green Party or Labor Party. But now I just looked at the polls today because the government fell because Wilders was not happy with them. They weren't hard enough on immigrants, basically. So he pulls out of the government. They won't let him be prime minister because he's such a controversial figure. But I just looked at the polls, and the Green Left Labor coalition is now neck and neck with the PVV. The PVV was far, far ahead before. So you see, again, social trends, societal trends do move, and they do respond, and they do react when parties and entities go too far. So let's hope that the basic core of our species is reasonable, and that this backlash that will come is already deeply formed and is beginning to be, noticed, and that dictatorial regimes, once and for all across the world, will, you know, fade away. And that's, I think, one of the strongest arguments that I use when I'm trying to advocate for this idea of, a global polity and, a oneness world, as we call it, is that, dictators take advantage of the fact that they have this little area of territory surrounded by an invisible wall, which are their borders of that country, in which they can do whatever they want, essentially, right? And they have basically a hiding place. So that's their hiding place. And if when they do get ousted, they go to another hiding place, right? So what like Assad went to Russia, and that's his new hiding place, right? Where he's safe there. In a global polity grounded deeply in an international constitution based on the International Bill of Rights, for instance, there would be fewer and fewer and ultimately no hiding places anymore. There's no wiggle room anymore. And the same would apply to, for instance, offshore banking possibilities where people hide trillions and trillions of dollars. There's like 7 or 12 trillion dollars hidden in secret bank accounts and offshore banking jurisdictions in the world today, almost all of which have the Union Jack in their flag, by the way. There's very few that don't have a Union Jack in their flag. So, that's just system set up by the British Empire, basically, which is still in place today. You wouldn't have that opportunity anymore either. Now, it might, it starts becoming questionable when you think about refugees and stuff, because refugees also are seeking that safe place, that hiding place, to get away from the bad. but that, I think those are, at least ideas worth exploring in terms of, building this new um, vision down the road. And I think there's already so many ingredients of it in place. I think that the leap is not nearly as far as a lot of people think it would be. And that's certainly part of our task here at Democracy Tomorrow, is to explore these things in workable, reasonable, not esoteric ways, and show that the simple fact that I, being an Australian citizen now and a Dutch citizen, but I can go to New Zealand tomorrow and live there as a New Zealander, no questions asked. That's the beginnings of open borders. As a
I'm a
European citizen,
Hungarian. I can live in Spain and France.
I could be your next door neighbor too, because I'm a Dutch citizen. So that's a step forward. And there's thousands of these, when you really start looking at them, there really are like so many things that are leading in this direction. And I think the Trump reality and Orban and these other neo-fascist movements and stuff, it's almost like a last gasp effort. It's like the dying, as you mentioned, the dying whims of the previous era, the last gasp, like, oh, if we don't hold on now, we'll be ruined forever by all these people of color. Oh no, terrible. And they'll do anything. They'll stop at nothing to push, including the dehumanization of entire groups of people, and I think it's very symbolically the end of a certain era and the beginning of something else. But this interim period is, not very nice, but we can't give up on the principles that we have, and we have to keep espousing them. And what better place to do it than with Reed Brody speaking from France the day the Tour de France ends. Just a
Came
few miles
past here the other day. I wasn't here, but it came past here the other day.
in your village. Did it go right through your village?
About 10 miles from 10
All right.
kilometers.
I
15
mean,
kilometers, as you guys would say. From 16
right.
kilometers. 16.2.
10 miles. Yeah, I was making a quart of water. Oh no, it was a pint, and I got 3 gallons of gas in my car. Yeah, right. Um, but I tell you, man, that when you see France every year, like from the Tour de France, the way they show those aerial shots of the villages and the towns and the countryside, it is.
Everybody from my village went to see it.
I bet you didn't go. You weren't one of
I
those
was in
guys.
Spain. I wasn't here. I was in Spain.
Well, thanks so much, Reed, for talking to us today. We hope you'll come back soon. And if you want to get more coverage of issues like this, please subscribe to Democracy Tomorrow, and we'll be back as soon as we can with the next episode. Thanks for watching, and see you all again soon. Take care. Bye.